Andersen Air Force Base in Guam saw the very first crash of the stealth B-2 aircraft Spirit of Kansas. Footage shows the aircraft speeding down the runway and starting to gain some altitude. The wing soon hits the ground and bursts, after which the aircraft slams against the runway in a cloud of smoke and flames. The Spirit of Kansas aircraft was one of the original B-2s developed by Northrop Grumman at the height of the Cold War. The stealth bomber, an impressive plane, could launch an attack against anti-aircraft defenses, delivering 50,000 pounds of munitions and succeeding in missions that would be impossible for most planes. Northrop built these planes from the 1980s to the early 2000s, creating a small fleet for an estimated cost of over $40 billion. A small group, including the Spirit of Kansas, were sent to Guam so the pilots could quickly access America's Asian rival nations, most importantly, China. The B-2 utilizes a flight control system for pilots based around 24-port transducer units that deliver essential data. The PTUs measure air pressure, leading 4 different computers to independently assess the angle of attack, side slip, altitude, and airspeed. Before the calculations are moved by the flight control system to the visible flight control panel, 3 out of 4 computers must have matching analyses. The island of Guam has a tropical rainforest climate that almost mimics the tropical monsoon climate during dry seasons. This humid environment called for frequent calibrations in the air data systems. When Andersen Air Force Base mechanics reached out to Northrop Grumman for advice on how to deal with the weather, Northrop Grumman hadn't installed any measures to deal with it. So the support engineers suggested using the pitot heater to dry the port transducer units before calibration. This heating system was intended to prevent icing, but using it extensively while on the ground could overheat the system. Mechanic technicians used the pitot heater successfully, but no protocol was formalized in any reports or in a technical order change. Because of this, only some of the pilots and crews using the B-2s during initial deployment knew that the air data systems were sensitive to moisture and that the pitot heater could be used to solve the issue. The first warning signs for the Spirit of Kansas came on the morning of February 25, 2008. After 4 months in Guam, it was preparing to return to regular formation at the Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, along with another B-2. The Spirit of Kansas would be serving as the lead plane during the return flight. The pre-flight check took place at around 9:30 a.m., and the crew of Spirit of Kansas got an air data cal message during it, meaning that the air data system needed calibration. Unfortunately, neither the flight control specialist nor the pilot knew that the pitot heater could be used to dry up the components, so they carried out the calibration without it. This caused 23 out of the 24 PTUs to render incorrect data. 1 hour later, in preparation for takeoff, the pitot heater was actually turned on, which dried up the sensors. It was too late by then. The wrong data made the altimeter show an elevation 136 feet higher than the actual airfield elevation, which the 2-man crew did not notice. 19 seconds into the takeoff roll, the master caution light turned on, as did the caution status for the flight control system. The crew considered canceling takeoff to check on the system, but 6 seconds later, the caution lights went away. All instruments then seemed to indicate that takeoff conditions were within the necessary parameters. This information was incorrect. The Spirit of Kansas pilot rotated the aircraft's nose for takeoff in an incorrectly indicated speed of 142 knots, when in reality wind speed was somewhere between 132 and 134 knots. He used normal stick force to set up the climb rate and pitch altitude, but again the incorrect data resulted in a miscalculated negative angle of attack, or nose-down attitude, which set the aircraft nose up to 30 degrees. The pilot lost control of the aircraft, with the conditions making it unrecoverable. Little could be done as the aircraft oscillated and inevitably rolled to the left. Its left wing scraped against the ground. Thinking fast, the crew members ejected from the aircraft. The B-2 dragged over an 18,964 square meter stretch between parallel runways. The wreckage spread out over the area, with fires that took a total of 8 hours to be put out. The destruction of Spirit of Kansas, which had flown for 5,100 hours under the 393rd Bomb Squad based in Missouri, represented the first crash of a B-2. One pilot was evaluated and discharged rapidly from the Guam Naval Hospital, while the other remained hospitalized for his injuries. After the crash, the U.S. Air Force Accident Board reviewed the conditions under which it took place. They discovered the root of the mistake lay in the miscalculated ADS system during calibration caused by moisture in the PTUs. As mentioned earlier, no formal procedure had been established to deal with moisture. The flight line technicians had not increased the requirements for air data calibration either during the deployment of these planes to Guam. Part of the problem had been that the air data system issue with calibration was not really observable during maintenance checks, but rather during pre-flight checks. Only one supervisor and a handful of technicians were aware of the moisture problem and how to solve it. The crew was found to have acted correctly under official standards and procedures. Furthermore, the complex interface used by the B-2 aircraft was too technical for most of the crew members involved. Few knew the importance of the air data calibration, resulting in none of them raising the issue in a formal complaint before the accident. The findings of the June 5, 2008 report were conclusive. The loss of Spirit of Kansas resulted in about $1.4 billion in property damage. Thankfully, one of the pilots only suffered from minor injuries. His co-pilot, on the other hand, underwent an extensive hospital stay for compression fractures to his spine, but he was able to recover completely. As a result of the accident, the Air Force's 509th Bomb Wing grounded all B-2s while safety procedures were reviewed. The temporary suspension saw all flight operations canceled until April of 2008. After the review, pitot heat was integrated into the calibration procedure.
On the afternoon of June 24, 1994, Spokane County residents watching the local news found out that a B-52 Stratofortress rehearsing maneuvers for an air show had crashed at Fairchild Air Force Base. While most other videos of the crash were immediately confiscated by the Air Force, one fell through the cracks, and the footage was aired while the bomber was still engulfed in flames. In the shocking images, the aircraft known as ZAR-52 and Fairchild's last remaining B-52H can be seen making a steep banking turn at low altitude, then suddenly stalling and plummeting to the ground, exploding into a fireball. The following day, Air Force investigators arrived at the scene to find out the reason behind the crash that ended 4 people's lives, uncovering a long and unfortunate history of disobedience and negligence. America's first long-range swept-wing heavy bomber, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, was the replacement for World War II's iconic B-29 Superfortress. Primarily designed to carry nuclear weapons, the B-52, flown by the United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command, was the country's first choice of defense against surprise attacks during the Cold War, before the invention of intercontinental ballistic missiles. While the original B-52's blueprint carried a 6-man crew, the number of crew members varied during training and proficiency flights. The aircraft's final variant, the improved B-52H, was quite a sight to behold, with a 185-foot wingspan powered by 8 powerful Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan jet engines. With the end of the Cold War, many of these final variant aircraft were housed in different Air Force bases, where they were kept and used for tests, and Fairchild Air Force Base was one of them. Built during World War II, the facility became an important Strategic Air Command base for B-52s in the Cold War, and by 1994, it was the nation's largest aerial refueling facility and home to the 92nd Air Refueling Wing. By June of that year, B-52 call-name ZAR-52 was the last of 7 Stratofortress that remained at Fairchild Air Force Base while awaiting a relocation flight to Minot Base in North Dakota. However, this aircraft was temporarily retained so flight crews could remain proficient in their specialties, and the other B-52s were relocated to other Strategic Air Command bases. Then, on June 24th, ZAR-52 and a KC-135 Strato tanker took off from the airbase to practice a series of maneuvers for an upcoming air show. Soon, The partly sunny summer afternoon in the Spokane outskirts would become the darkest day in Fairchild Air Base history. Piloting the ZAR-52 was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Bud Holland, chief of the 92nd Bomb Wing Standardization and Evaluation Branch, along with co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan. Rounding out the four-person crew were radar navigator Lieutenant Colonel Ken Houston and safety observer Colonel Robert Wolfe. During the practice, the B-52 and the KC-135 slowly circled the airfield while flying in tandem and making flybys down the runway. Then, just 15 minutes after they had taken off, they started to prepare to execute the touch-and-go landing at the end of the practice profile, and the B-52 was instructed to go around as the KC-135 was just landing on the runway. Maintaining an altitude of about 250 feet, Holland then radioed the control tower, requesting permission to execute a 360-degree left turn, with the tower controller subsequently granting the request. While approaching the runway's end, Holland climbed the aircraft steeply, and at an altitude of 250 feet, banked left into a tight 360-degree turn around the back of the air traffic control tower. The maneuver, however, proved to be too much for the aircraft, and the low altitude made any attempt to recover impossible. ZAR-52 went past 90 degrees, blocking all airflow over the wings. At 2:16 p.m., the B-52 stalled and plummeted to the ground, exploding into a giant fireball, and narrowly missing a 3-story building filled with about 300 Air Force Survival School students, instructors, and staff members enjoying a farewell party. And while only one person on the ground was injured, the 4 crew members didn't survive. The crash caused some damage to the base, as the bomber's tip of the left wing clipped power transmission lines, disrupting electrical service in the control tower and several civilian homes. In fact, the wreckage site could have caused a major atomic disaster, as the crash occurred only 50 feet away from the base's underground nuclear weapons storage area. Within minutes, rescue teams and emergency crews arrived at the crash site as a large cloud of toxic black smoke flared in the Washington skies. It took the management team nearly 3 hours to finally extinguish the massive flames, and the only remaining recognizable piece of the aircraft was the frame of the tail section, looming over the devastation, charred beyond distinction. Then, on June 25th, the U.S. Air Force convened a safety investigation board to determine why the 89-ton bomber had crashed. Because B-52s were not equipped with flight data recorders like commercial aircraft are, the investigation, under the direction of Air Force Chief of Safety Brigadier General Orrin L. Godsey, focused on radio transmissions, the flight plan, the aircraft's upkeep records, and the crew's personal records. However, the board also had a crucial piece of evidence not usually available in most accidents: private video footage of the bomber's final run. While most of the videotapes were confiscated by the security police, one escaped detection and ended up being aired on local television while the wreckage was still burning. Then, on September 28th, the Air Force Accident Investigations Board released the results of the investigation. Several factors were listed, including the sudden addition of the 360-degree maneuver, inadequate pre-flight involvement by Colonel Robert Wolfe, and the 10-knot wind at the time of the crash. Still, the accident was largely blamed on the pilot, who was practicing unauthorized and unsafe maneuvers for the B-52's size and weight. In fact, Bud Holland was not new to breaking the rules. Assigned to Fairchild Air Force Base in 1988, Lieutenant Colonel Holland quickly earned a reputation in the Strategic Air Command as a highly skilled yet dangerously aggressive pilot who often pushed aircraft to their limits. For 3 years, Holland had developed a pattern of blatant disobedience and insubordination, including often flying below minimum clearance altitudes, exceeding bank angle limitations and climb rates, and exploding in verbal tirades against his fellow crew members. Holland's antics went so far that many Fairchild officers refused to fly with him. On the day of the crash, Holland had ignored the safety rules once again. By flying too low, he caused ZAR-52 to bank too steeply, resulting in the loss of 4 high-ranking officers, a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and infrastructure damage. But while the board determined that Holland was responsible for the crash, they also criticized the airbase's chain of command. According to the investigation, with more than 2 decades in the Air Force and over 5,000 hours of flying experience with B-52s, Holland's superiors repeatedly turned a blind eye to his infractions, letting him off with mere verbal reprimands and not taking the necessary measures to prevent a tragic incident in the future. On May 19, 1995, Colonel William Pellerin, the 92nd Bomb Wing's flight operations officer and Holland's direct superior, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of dereliction of duty for his actions, or lack thereof, that contributed to the tragic crash. The investigation presented at the Air Force court-martial proceeding stated that Pellerin never reprimanded the pilot over his antics. The colonel was sentenced to forfeit $1,500 of his monthly salary for a period of 5 months and also received a written reprimand. Several critics of the U.S. Air Force's safety record also remarked that the crash was an example of a series of problems related to rule enforcement within the organization. To this day, the Fairchild Air Force Base crash is used as an example of the importance of complying with safety regulations in both civilian and military flight training, as well as the significance of promptly correcting the behavior of anyone who violates those procedures. In April of 1988, in a joint effort between the Sandia Laboratories, the United States government, and the Japanese Muto Institute of Structural Mechanics, a fully functioning F-4 Phantom jet crashed into a reinforced concrete wall at 480 miles per hour. Ever since the first nuclear power plant was built in June of 1954 in Obninsk, Russia, the ever-looming fear of a devastating wipeout that could impact the world has been present. But although there have been a few significant incidents involving nuclear reactions, such as the Chernobyl and Kyshtym disasters or the Windscale fire, these episodes have never originated from planned terrorist activity. This is mainly because dozens of government agencies from around the world have taken precautionary measures to prevent a disastrous nuclear event, building heavily guarded nuclear facilities protected by thick walls. But in 1988, the United States government wanted to test the effectiveness of the reinforced concrete used in the construction of their nuclear facilities. The Sandia National Laboratories, founded in 1949, are among the National Nuclear Security Administration's research and development laboratories. Their primary objectives are developing, engineering, and testing the non-nuclear components of nuclear weapons and high technology. In the late 1980s, Sandia Laboratories came up with an idea to explore the concrete strength through a highly unusual test. To explore the strength of the concrete structures, Sandia Laboratories came up with the idea of launching a McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II supersonic jet at full speed into a rectangular wall of reinforced 12-foot thick concrete. The wall would weigh 469 tons, 25 times heavier than the aircraft, and be placed on an air-bearing platform that enabled free movement in the direction of the impact. In April of 1988, the test was performed at the Sandia Laboratories premises in California. Under the terms of a contract signed with the Japanese Muto Institute of Structural Mechanics, the engineers installed 16 high-speed framing cameras to record the crash, shooting up to 2,000 frames per second. The fully functional F-4 Phantom weighed 42,000 pounds and was filled with water to simulate its fuel weight. The jet interceptor was loaded onto a rocket sled and accelerated to a speed of about 480 miles per hour with the help of rocket boosters. It then impacted the reinforced concrete wall head-on, and the footage shows the crash from several angles. The impact atomized the aircraft's tail, fuselage, and canopy into billions of minute pieces, disappearing in a cloud of smoke and fire. Parts of the destroyed aircraft and bits of crushed engines landed on adjoining terrains. The only section of the Phantom that remained intact was a small piece from a wing that missed the wall entirely. The concrete block only suffered minor structural damage, with perforations no more than 2.4 inches deep. The target was supported by airbags, which enabled it to move with the objective of measuring the force of impact. The crash's potency pulled the block back a mere 1.82 meters. It still was a high-energy impact. As the aircraft's engine exploded into small pieces, it experienced an acceleration force of over 700 G-forces. A year after the test, Walter von Riesemann, Sandia's Containment Technology Division supervisor, spoke at the International Conference on Structural Mechanics in Reactor Technology about the test's importance. Quote, "The crash data are going to give us an unprecedented ability to predict the impact force when an aircraft crashes into a building. We'd previously done some fairly accurate computer analysis, but the computer models were untried on the real thing. Not anymore." Sandia officials later added that although these kind of tests might seem superfluous, they are in fact highly critical. Quote, "Researchers need to estimate the structural response of a building in such an accident. To do that, they must know how the impact force changes throughout the brief time the crash is in progress." In the end, the 1988 experiment proved that the reinforced concrete walls to protect the US's nuclear reactors could stop a standard jet from inflicting grave damage on their contained atomic weapons, averting a local atomic disaster.
Seen here, the Northrop M2-F2, a prototype that would eventually serve as a model for the space shuttle, flies gracefully through a clear sky. Everything goes wrong, however, as it attempts to land, and the voice of a man in ground control decisively calls out, quote, "Get the fire truck out!" The crash came at the end of a glide test for the heavyweight lifting body spacecraft, designed and intended for astronauts to fly back from space. Even though NASA was in the middle of trying to put a man on the moon, the organization believed it needed to continue building and testing a variety of craft, including ones that could routinely return from space piloted by an astronaut. Beginning in 1963, the Dryden Flight Research Center at the Edwards Air Force Base was taken over by engineers focusing on creating a wingless spacecraft that could produce lift from its body. The undertaking was almost canceled when in 1967, one of those lifting body spacecraft crashed and rolled during landing. NASA was inspired to build the heavyweight lifting bodies after successful testing of the M2-F1, a lightweight, unpowered prototype that tested the concept of a lifting body. That first model became known as the Flying Bathtub because of its unique shape. The two resulting spacecraft that were designed were the M2-F2 and the HL-10, both based on studies from the Ames and Langley research facilities and built by the Northrop Corporation. Both would have their first test flights carried out in 1966. The M and F in the craft's name stood for manned and flight respectively. While its body was 22 feet long, its wingspan was only a little over 9 feet wide. The engine used was the very first liquid propellant rocket engine used by the United States on an aerial vehicle. As propellant, it used ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen, generating a peak thrust of 6,000 pounds of force. The first captive test flight, carried aloft by an adapted B-52, was conducted on March 23rd of 1966. The first free test flight of an unpowered F-2, which was still very similar to the early F-1 model, was carried out on July 12, 1966, with pilot Milton O. Thompson at the helm. At an altitude of 45,000 feet, or 13,700 meters, Thompson was dropped inside the F-2 from the wing pylon mount of the adapted B-52. In the coming seconds, he would reach a gliding speed of 450 miles per hour, or 720 kilometers per hour, and successfully land the craft. The M2-F2 was flown 16 times on these test glide flights, 5 of those times by the original pilot Milton O. Thompson, and 3 by Bruce Peterson, whose last flight on an F-2 ended in disaster. Bruce A. Peterson sat inside the heavyweight lift body craft, preparing for the B-52 to drop him over the desert of Edwards on May 10, 1967. He was as much of a veteran as one could be at flying the new type of vehicle, as he had flown the F-1 and the HL-10 already, and had been trained at both the Naval Aviation School and the Air Force Test Pilot School. Outside, the sun was shining, and the sky was clear. While this was only a glide test flight, it was in the schedule to actually start using the XLR-11 rocket engine on the next set of flights. The craft was dropped at the desired altitude, and Peterson began guiding it gracefully to its steep descent into Edwards Base. But as he approached the lakebed runway, the F-2 began suffering from oscillations induced by his attempts at controlling the craft. At the root of the issue were the wings of the M2-F2, which produced significantly less roll authority than most other aircraft, resulting in less force available for him to control it while in roll. He tried responding through roll maneuvers that were less successful than he hoped, leading to the pilot-induced oscillation in the roll axis. The craft increasingly rolled from side to side while still in flight as he tried to rein it in. Thanks to his expertise, though, he was still able to bring things under control before running into another unexpected issue. As NASA official Yvonne Gibbs explained, quote, Peterson recovered, but then observed a rescue helicopter that seemed to pose a collision threat. He was immediately distracted, sending a radioed request to get the helicopter moved, but there was too little time. He was forced to drift in a crosswind towards an unmarked area of the lakebed runway, where he could not properly assess the height over the ground due to a lack of markers. In an attempt to provide extra lift, he fired the landing rockets, but the craft hit the runway before the landing gear was down and locked. From there, the F-2 rolled 6 times with its pilot inside until it stopped upside down. The footage of the accident was highly distributed as part of the 1973 TV series, The $6 Million Man. Assessing the damage and the cause of the accident, NASA was able to determine that the craft had lateral control problems despite its stability augmentation control system. An updated M2-F2 was built at Dryden from the salvageable parts of this accidented prototype and was designated M2-F3. A third vertical fin in between the tip fins was added to overcome the control issues. These first tests by NASA using heavyweight lifting bodies answered scientific questions about the technology, paving the way for NASA's Dream Chaser, scheduled to resupply the International Space Station in 2021. The 1967 crash severely damaged Northrop's F2. Peterson was unable to eject and was also injured. He was pulled out of the vehicle by coworkers Jay King and Joseph Huxman to then be rushed to the hospital at the base. Due to the severity of his injuries, he was moved to the March Air Force Base Hospital and then to the University of California, Los Angeles Hospital. After an excessive stay, Peterson lost all vision in his right eye, but otherwise recovered. Wearing an eye patch, Peterson continued to work on support missions, on research flights, and continued his flying duties with the Marine Reserve up until 1971. By his retirement, Peterson had flown almost 70 different vehicles and logged in more than 6,000 flight hours. He stated that he did not approve of his crash being televised and so frequently shown, as if it were the most notable thing he had done.
On September 29, 2020, people from Southern California witnessed the terrifying crash of a Marine Corps F-35 Joint Strike Fighter after colliding with a KC-130J Hercules during a mid-air refueling exercise. Observers on the ground filmed the F-35 fighter as it made its way through the desolated land, leaving behind a trail of smoke. A moment later, the fighter exploded in a massive fireball. In the 10-second-long video, one of the spectators, a woman standing near a yellow Jeep, asks in Spanish, quote, "Is the other one okay?" referring to the gigantic KC-130. Although not shown in the video, the USCM pilot ejected successfully before the crash. However, the crew of the KC-130J, with 2 engines out and rapidly leaking fuel, was at a hard spot for survival. Searching for a landing place for a colossal airplane, such as a KC-130 gunship, was no easy thing. Running out of time, the pilot decided to flip a coin in the air and attempt an emergency landing at a farmer's field near Riverside, California. The pilot ordered the crew to brace for impact and performed the feat. Miraculously, the entire crew survived and sustained minor injuries, as did the aircraft. Landing the 75,000-pound Colossus was a remarkable success that could have gone sideways. The F-35B was assigned to the Green Knights of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121, and the KC-130J to the Raiders of Marine Aerial Refueler Transport Squadron 352. Both were performing a weapons and tactics instructor course that was going according to plan. In an interview with USNI News, a Marine spokeswoman said that, quote, WTI is a 7-week training event hosted by Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1, which emphasizes operational integration of Marine Corps aviation in support of a Marine Air-Ground Task Force. Everything seemed to go well when the planes began the mid-air refueling. But suddenly, the collision occurred. The F-35B went directly into a dive, and the pilot lost complete control of the aircraft before the crash. However, the KC-130 Hercules stayed in the air for longer, while the pilot looked for a spot to land without further damaging the plane and the 8-man crew. Audio recordings from air traffic control published online revealed how professionally the KC-130J pilot dealt with the situation after the collision. Flying under the call sign Raider 50, the KC-130J is initially heard requesting the LA Center to fly into the high-altitude block of the Kane West MOA near the Salton Sea. The area was crowded with aircraft traffic, but the KC-130 was cleared to enter at almost 18,000 feet. Based on a report from USNI News, after minutes of peace and silence, the pilot from American Airlines Flight 237 contacted air traffic control and told the LA Center, quote, "We're going to report that there was some sort of flares, some sort of pyrotechnic device, at our 2 o'clock position, less than 10 nautical miles, maybe 5 miles away, at an altitude of probably 25,000 feet. The American Airlines pilot also pointed at the exact site where the F-35B exploded. Immediately after that, Raider 50 contacted air traffic control and said, quote, LA Center, Raider 50 declaring an emergency. Mid-air collision with Vault 93. We have 2 engines out. We are leaking fuel and likely on fire, and an emergency descent at this time. Raider 50. Air traffic control asked the aircraft to confirm if they were really going down. The KC-130 pilot was only able to say, quote, "We declare an emergency. We have still partial control of the aircraft. 2 engines out." LA Center was not able to make full contact again as the KC-130 began to rapidly lose altitude. For a brief second, air traffic control heard the pilot say that engines 3 and 4 were also gone, but contact broke out. Although the pilot aimed for the thermal airport near the Salton Sea, he landed at a farmer's field near the zone. The pilot and the crew survived and only suffered minor wounds. The aircraft, besides the engines, only sustained damage to its belly. One day after the crash video emerged online and media outlets published it, an official press statement was released detailing the accident's background. Marine Corps Air Station Yuma said, quote, "At approximately 1600, it was reported that an F-35B made contact with the KC-130J during an air-to-air refueling evolution, resulting in the crash of the F-35B. The pilot of the F-35B ejected successfully and is currently being treated. The KC-130J is on deck in the vicinity of Thermal Airport. All crew members of the KC-130J have been reported safe." As First Lieutenant Brett Vanier, a spokesman from the USMC Air Station Yuma, said, quote, "It was an impressive maneuver bringing it down safely by force. His skills kind of speak to itself, just in the fact that everyone survived." It was a cloudy and calm afternoon as Major Mike Freyholtz and his crew meticulously prepared to conduct a practice sortie for the upcoming Arctic Thunder Air Show at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Alaska. Freyholtz had flown C-17 cargo planes for more than 600 hours in Iraq and Afghanistan and was a daring pilot who studied every detail and was not afraid to push his aircraft to the absolute limits if it meant saving a fellow soldier's life. With such vast experience, that practice flight scheduled for July 28, 2010 seemed like a relatively straightforward affair, but no one could have guessed it was about to turn into a horrific tragedy. Footage taken by a staff member shows how the massive C-17 Globemaster airlifter, nicknamed Sitka 43, lifted off from the airstrip and then climbed for a few seconds before turning. Still, the cargo plane's turn was too sharp, and it suddenly started losing speed. The spectators on site then held their breath as the $202.3 million, 141-ton behemoth with 4 people on board stalled and plunged to the ground. The Boeing C-17 Globemaster III is one of the most reliable and safe aircraft in the U.S. military, and its extraordinary performance and ease of flight made it the backbone of the U.S. Air Force airlift capabilities. The military transport aircraft has been used in a wide array of operations across the globe, successfully supporting U.S. military efforts in some of the most dangerous war zones on the planet. It has also evacuated injured servicemen from Iraq, deployed paratroopers behind enemy lines, rescued civilians from Kabul, and landed under fire to deliver vital supplies to U.S. military troops. Amid such a long and successful career, not once had the mighty C-17 Globemaster suffered a catastrophic crash, but it would all change during a routine practice flight in 2010 at the Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. The sortie, scheduled for July 28, 2010, was a rehearsal for a maximum performance climb demonstration that was meant to take place during the incoming Arctic Thunder Air Show from July 31st to August 1st. The plan entailed having the C-17 climb to 1,500 feet above the ground to initiate a reversal turn. The pilot, Major Mike Freyholtz, would then fly a safe distance away from the runway before performing a 260-degree reversal turn back towards the runway. The C-17 would then descend from 1,500 feet to 500 feet above the ground and accelerate to 250 knots to fly past the spectators gathered at the air show. That afternoon, the crew used operational risk management to evaluate the mission risk, which resulted in a caution warning based on the complexity of the maneuvers. Still, all crew members agreed that the flight was safe and thus prepared for the flight. Freyholtz, as commander and pilot, first flew around the base area to confirm that the wind and flight conditions were adequate for their practice run. The weather was accepted as being within the desired limits, and they then touched down and waited half an hour to begin the sortie. The pilot was described by one of his instructors as, quote, one of the most precise and exacting pilots in the Air Force, and one of the most talented and capable warriors of his generation. Going back to his days as a pilot in training, Freyholtz was known to prepare meticulously for each assignment. He would frequently split flights into segments, events, and contingencies, and recorded each in detail for further study. As a full-fledged pilot, he continued his remarkable service, logging over 600 flight hours while serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, and receiving numerous decorations for his exemplary performance and his constant yearning to go beyond the call of duty. However, unbeknownst to him, this fearless attitude might have resulted in the decision that would lead to a fatal accident. The flight would be carried out with a crew of 4: Freyholtz, pilot Alan Malone, Captain Jeffrey Hill, and Senior Master Sergeant Thomas E. Sicardo. At 6:22 p.m. local time, Freyholtz initiated a maximum power takeoff with a nose-high attitude of 40 degrees. All 4 engines were set to full thrust and remained as such throughout the flight. The C-17 Globemaster then leveled off at 850 feet above the ground level instead of the 1,500 feet required for the maneuver. Additionally, the sharp climb with a 40-degree nose-high attitude meant that the aircraft never achieved the minimum climb-out airspeed. The C-17's peak airspeed in the climb was 107 knots, and the planning required a speed of at least 133 knots. In short, they were flying too low and too slow. Back at the airbase, a serviceman recorded video of the maneuver, but not for a moment did he expect what was about to occur. Despite flying so low, Freyholtz decided to start the 260-degree reversal turn and banked left 57 degrees, then leveling off at 852 feet above ground level. The aircraft then reached a speed of 151 knots, and the co-pilot retracted the flaps according to procedure. The C-17 was stable during the 7 seconds it took to retract the flaps. Still, as the procedure finished, Freyholtz initiated an aggressive right turn. At that moment, the first officer began the slat retraction as they reached 188 knots. However, the minimum speed to safely achieve it was 193 knots. The stall warning sounded 5 seconds into the sharp turn. By then, the C-17's speed was 199 knots, 6 knots below stall speed. The cockpit's intercom system then started to blast. Stall. 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 Freyholtz's crew appeared to trust the pilot's decisions, and despite his better judgment, the co-pilot called out, quote, temperature, altitude, looking good. Freyholtz continued the turn, increasing the angle of bank 62 degrees. At that moment, the aircraft was not only beyond the 45-degree arc of bank recommended for the maneuver, but had also surpassed the 60-degree maximum allowable bank angle for the C-17. The aircraft then went into a minimal left roll, and the speed and attitude made recovery impossible. 2 seconds later, the C-17 crashed into a wooded area and was soon engulfed in a colossal fireball. Only 1 minute had elapsed since takeoff. The captain of the Anchorage Fire Department watched as a fireball rose 750 feet into the air. It was clear that there was no chance of survival. All 4 crew members on board the C-17 lost their lives. Despite being equipped with an angle of attack limiter system designed to protect the aircraft from a deep stall, the pilot's decisions were so sudden and significant that the system could not prevent the tragedy. The eventual investigation claimed that Freiholz made a series of unfortunate decisions that did not reflect in any way the planning that had previously been agreed upon for the mission. Many analysts attribute such decisions to sloppiness or recklessness, but the airmen who knew Freiholz believe he was once again trying to push his aircraft and training to the limit. The investigation ultimately deemed that the accident was caused by pilot error, and the airshow went on as a tribute to the 4 men aboard the C-17. For the 75th anniversary of the Royal Air Force in 1993, the Royal International Air Tattoo Military Airshow presented a spectacle with over 200 aircraft from all over the world. Amidst the celebration in Gloucester, England, 2 Russian MiG-29s collided as they attempted a crossover trick, slicing one of the jets in half. About 250,000 spectators stared at the sky, saw the cloud of smoke and fire, and wondered if the pilots had safely ejected as the jets crashed into the ground. The Mikoyan MiG-29, known to NATO as Fulcrum, is a twin-engine fighter jet designed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Developed as an air superiority fighter during the early 1970s, the MiG-29 was built alongside the Sukhoi Su-27 to counter famous American fighters like the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon. The Fulcrum entered service with the Soviet Air Forces in 1982. After the dissolution of the Union in December 1991, armies worldwide continued to use it in a variety of roles. More than 30 nations have either operated or still use the jet. The Fulcrum is a prized asset in many military forces, even though it possesses a deplorable combat record. Even though a MiG-29 is aerodynamically first-rate, it is also a reflection of its Soviet doctrine and limitations. It does not feature modern pilot displays and controls, and its sensors are subpar compared to Western aircraft of the time. Because Soviet pilots were usually directed by ground controllers, their visibility and situation awareness were not high priorities. Another major limitation of the MiG-29 is its limited flying range. It has a capacity for fewer than 900 miles on internal fuel and cannot be refueled while in flight. Finally, the MiG fighter models weren't built to work for a long time. A standard American aircraft of the era would have a flight life of 6,000 hours, while the MiG-29 only worked for about 2,500. In July 1993, the Royal International Air Tattoo, the world's largest military air show, celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Royal Air Force with its iconic parade. Over 200 aircraft from around the world took part in flying displays, including the Grumman F-14 Tomcat, McDonnell Douglas F-4F Phantom II, Lockheed C-130 Hercules, and a de Havilland Mosquito. A pair of Fulcrums were included in the group. At around 3 p.m., the MiG-29s, part of the Russian Flight Research Institute, departed in close formation to commence their flight display. The weather conditions were overcast, and the crowd cheered excitedly as the iconic jets took off to execute their maneuvers. The exhibition went smoothly until the final trick, which consisted of a simultaneous loop, forming a long line astern before braking to land. The leading jet pulled up first and carried out a standard loop. The MiG-29 entered a cloud at the top. But when the second pilot followed, he performed a tighter loop and experienced difficulties in the cloud. At that moment, the pilots lost visual contact with each other. The leader was flying lower than initially planned and not far enough from the second jet. The leader's pilot decided to carry out his brake to downwind, hoping that it would take him out of the other jet's flight path. But before he could perform the maneuver, the leader's left wing impacted the fuselage of number 2, slicing it in half. Both jets spun out of control, and a cloud of smoke and fire filled the air. One of the jets impacted the airfield's northeast area, 2,300 feet away from the crowd, while the other MiG-29 crashed on top of the perimeter fence. The pilots were able to eject successfully. Sergei Trezvyatsky and Alexander Beshashtnov landed safely with no significant injuries. They were released from the hospital a few days later. On site, 12 spectators were treated for shock, and one woman suffered minor scorch injuries from the blast. After the incident, the Ministry of Defense announced that the Royal International Air Tattoo safety rules would not be evaluated, as no one had gotten seriously injured. According to the tattoo spokesman, Squadron Leader Harry Burgoyne, this was the first accident in the show's 20-year history. In the late 1980s, authorities had tightened the rules for all European air shows after the Ramstein disaster of 1988, where 2 jets collided and crashed over 69 spectators during an air show in Germany. The Royal Air Force did investigate the incident with the Fulcrums. After interviewing the pilots, they learned that the aircraft collided because the lead pilot aborted the maneuver when he lost sight of the aircraft. The Royal International Air Tattoo continues to perform to this day, with spectators marveling at military aircraft performing incredible maneuvers in the air. date was January 22, 2019. It was a freezing night in Murmansk, a Russian region deep within the Arctic Circle. Over the snowy scenery, a Soviet-era Tu-22M3 supersonic bomber flew back to base after an undisclosed training operation. A wide variety of training exercises are conducted by the Russian Air Force every day. Most result in a safe return and landing. But on that winter night, a sequence of ill-fated events created the perfect storm for a catastrophic accident. As the aircraft descended into an approach and landing position, the entire military base was abruptly overrun by a dense blizzard. In a split second, the pilot found himself within a white curtain with zero visibility. The runway disappeared in front of his eyes. Unable to locate the airstrip for a safe landing, the pilot and crew decided to quickly eject from the jet before impact. But the ejection systems failed to deploy. Below, standing near the snow-covered airstrip, a soldier recorded a video of what he expected to be a safe routine landing, even if the weather conditions were not optimal. He continued to capture the expanding snowstorm, waiting for the moment when the Tu-22M3 would emerge from within the icy clouds. The sounds from the forthcoming jet started to grow louder. Suddenly, the lights of the plane can be seen approaching within the whiteout. The aircraft is coming in too fast and not at the right angle for a safe landing. The soldier recording the event shouts, surprised, as he notices the speed at which the aircraft is coming in. Inside the aircraft, the crew attempted to perform an emergency landing after they failed to eject. Blinded by the blizzard, the pilot tried to calculate the position of the runway. Still, as the plane cleared the blizzard, he realized the ground was much closer than expected. The soldier's handheld camera started to shake as the aircraft emerged from the blizzard. The jet touched down with twice the force it was built to endure. In that second, the plane broke in half in front of the recording camera. The Russian Tu-22M3 was not a conventional jet. With an active career of almost 60 years, this mighty bomber is among the older and most reliable aircraft models in the Russian Air Force service. The model was designed during the 1960s during the Cold War, when Russia was still the Soviet Union. At the time, this Tu-22M3 was a technological masterpiece. Its variable sweep wing technology allowed it to surpass hypersonic speeds of over 1,490 miles per hour while flying at cruising altitudes and attaining safe minimal velocities when ready to land or take off. The aircraft was classified as a long-range bomber, which meant that it could travel distances up to 4,300 miles to engage its targets. Theoretically, it could reach the mainland US from Russia if needed. And if this range wasn't enough, the jet was fitted with a mid-air refueling system that allowed it to stay in the air for extremely long operations around the globe. In addition, the aircraft's bomb bay could carry a payload of 24 tons, and it was designed to deploy nuclear warheads if the mission had such requirements. The aircraft was designed to be operated by a crew of 4 Air Force specialists, 2 pilots, 1 navigation officer, and a weapons system operator. It was also built as a Cold War powerhouse, capable of quickly reaching any target in the world to deliver a rain of nuclear destruction. A total of 500 Tu-22M3 bombers were produced, and they continue to be used in strike operations around the globe by Russia and its allies. With such formidable features, it's no wonder that it's become an especially valued asset for the Russian Air Force. During the numerous decades it's been in service, the jet has gone through several modernization procedures to update its multiple navigations and weapons systems. Although the Tu-22M3 is a remnant of the 60s, it's still more than capable of leading modern warfare operations and performing adequately against much newer enemy aircraft. Showcasing such an array of imposing advantages, plus a long history of excellent, consistent performance, losing one of these commanding bombers in a devastating crash accident was a dire scenario for the Russian military. The night of January 22, 2019, one particular Tu-22M3 unit took off from Olnogorsk Air Base in Russia's northwestern region of Murmansk to conduct training operations. The exact nature of these exercises has never been disclosed. Still, as the model was scheduled to undergo additional updates and modifications in 2020 to future-proof it again, it's reasonable to conclude that these trials had something to do with the new systems being tested. The aircraft carried out its training while being operated by a whole 4-man team: a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigations officer, and the weapon deployment specialist. The Russian Ministry of Defense later declared that the mission had been a success all the way to the landing-descent process. At that moment, the unexpected happened. Just before the aircraft finished its descent, a heavy blizzard suddenly formed on top of the airbase, obstructing all view of the airstrip where the Tu-22M3 was to land. Such an abrupt and voluminous change in the weather might seem like science fiction. However, in the Arctic Circle, the rapid formation of these dense snowstorms is a frequent event, even when they seldom occur in other parts of the world. Several reports would later confirm that the weather conditions in the base at the time of the accident were deplorable, with a cloud base of almost 300 feet, a temperature of 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and a hefty amount of snow and mist. Had the blizzard begun by a more conventional and steady process, the control tower at the airbase would have been able to warn the pilot on the Tu-22M3. The landing would have then been postponed, or its location changed to minimize the risks of an accident. But as things happened, neither the control tower nor the pilot realized the storm's severity until the jet was about to land. When the aircraft's crew found themselves engulfed inside the total whiteout, the pilot realized that the risks of landing the aircraft had brusquely become too high. The team then attempted to deploy the ejection systems to no avail. The Ministry of Defense would later declare that the systems had failed either due to a mechanical malfunction or a human error. A safety measure would prevent deployment if the system was engaged while the altitude was already too low. Running out of options, the crew braced themselves for an emergency landing. The pilot deployed the landing gears and hoped the distance between the plane and the runway would be sufficient to reach the adequate angle and deceleration for a safe touchdown. The footage reveals that the plane emerged from the blizzard at a speed of over 180 miles per hour. The angle of descent was also not optimal, but some commentators argue that the steep approach could have been a minor issue if not for the speed. As the jet's landing gear touched the frozen runway, it impacted with a force of 7.13 G, surpassing the aircraft's 4G structural limit. The powerful impact on the front of the airframe caused the jet to split into two before being engulfed by a ball of fire. The aircraft then continued to break apart as it traveled across the runway, and the jet's nose flipped in a complete 360-degree spin while the wings shattered and spread in different directions. The Russian Air Force immediately deployed emergency vehicles to the scene of the accident. However, the impact had been devastating. The two pilots and a third crew member were lost in the immediate chaos, and the other crew member was in a critical care unit for weeks after the incident. Fortunately, he lived to tell the story of the terrifying crash landing. As a motorist passed by Bagram Air Base, one of the largest and most important United States military bases in Afghanistan, the motorcycle's camera managed to capture a horrible sight. In the video, a National Air Cargo Boeing 747 freighter flying on behalf of the United States Mobility Command crashes shortly after takeoff. The footage from April of 2013 shows how the aircraft suddenly goes out of control, as noted by an abnormal pitch-up rotation and stall. Then, as it touches the ground, the plane erupts into flames near the end of the runway. The Afghan authorities immediately denied claims that the crash happened because of enemy intervention, and the United States National Transportation Safety Board and the Afghanistan Civil Aviation Authority then banded together to look for answers. The results unveiled an unfortunate chain of events that rendered the fatal accident completely avoidable. On April 29, 2013, a National Air Cargo Boeing 747 freighter flying on behalf of the United States Mobility Command took off from Bagram Airfield after refueling. The aircraft was set to perform a cargo flight from the Afghan airbase to deliver 5 heavy armored military vehicles to Dubai Al Maktoum. Shortly after taking off from Bagram's runway at 3:30 p.m., the aircraft's nose suddenly rose in a brusque manner while climbing at 1,200 feet. The 747 then stalled and sharply banked right after a slight bank to the left, indicating an asymmetrical lift. Although the aircraft soon righted itself, it then went down at a shallow angle towards the ground, erupting into a ball of flames at the end of the runway within the boundaries of the U.S. airbase. The crash was later confirmed by the aircraft's owners, National Air Cargo. Sadly, all 7 crew members perished, and no one was injured on the ground. Amongst the victims in the crash was pilot Brad Hassler, a 34-year-old captain who had worked for the airline for almost a decade and had accumulated 6,000 flight hours, including 440 hours on the Boeing 747. The first officer was Jamie Lee Brokaw, who had worked for the airline since 2009 and had 1,100 flight hours, with 209 of them on the 747. The other crew members were Relief Captain Jeremy Lipka, Relief First Officer Rinku Schumann, Loadmaster Michael Sheets, and 2 mechanics, Gary Stockdale and Tim Garrett. After the accident, Bagram's district governor, Abdul Shukur, was interviewed by Reuters and claimed that the plane reached an altitude of about 1,300 feet before it suddenly went down. After the dramatic accident was captured on the dash cam of a passerby vehicle, it was published online, and the video went viral within hours, leading to wide-ranging speculation about the cause of the incident. The Taliban, the jihadist political movement in Afghanistan, initially claimed responsibility for the crash. However, their involvement was denied by NATO. This claim was further discredited when Afghan authorities denied accusations that the crash of the civilian cargo aircraft was caused by enemy activities. Initially, the United States National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, worked alongside the Afghanistan Civil Aviation Authority to investigate the crash. In addition, representatives from the Federal Aviation Administration and Boeing also provided aid and technical expertise during the examination. At a press conference on June 2nd, a little over a month after the crash, the Afghan investigators briefed the general public about 3 armored vehicles and 2 minesweepers that were in the aircraft and totaled 80 tons of weight. As the plane took off, the cargo seemed to have shifted, and the center of gravity moved so far back that the pilot lost control of the aircraft, causing the tragic accident. While charred, the recovered straps used to tie down the cargo provided evidence of having broken down before the final impact. Still, it was unclear whether these fractures happened before or after takeoff. In October of 2014, Afghan authorities reported that they had delegated the remainder of the investigation to the NTSB, and the organization opened the docket the following February. The National Transportation Safety Board then confirmed in June of 2015 that the National Airlines Boeing 747 freighter Flight 102 crashed on takeoff because of the inadequate restraints on the 5 military vehicles it was carrying. As stated in the report, this improper protocol led to at least 1 vehicle moving rearward, thus crippling essential hydraulic systems, damaging the horizontal stabilizer components, and making the airplane uncontrollable. The report also added that while on the ground in the base, the captain was informed by a crew member that one of the straps had broken. The 7-person crew then engaged in a discussion about a possible load shift while the aircraft had previously landed in Bagram, and there was also a discussion regarding further resecuring of the load before departure. However, the aircraft departed an hour later, and it is unclear if anything was done. According to the investigation, the Federal Aviation Administration's inadequate and frequent oversight of National Airlines' handling of special cargo loads also contributed to the accident. The enterprise is the parent company of National Air Cargo. The study claimed that National Airlines' official cargo operations manual omitted critical information from Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, as well as from the cargo handling system manufacturer about how they adequately secured cargo. In addition, the National Airlines manual also contained incorrect restraining methods for special cargo loads. According to NTSB Chairman Christopher A. Hart, who spoke at the outset of the board meeting, quote, "The crew took on an important mission to support American forces abroad and lost their lives not to enemy fire, but to an accident. We cannot change what happened, but in fully investigating this accident, we hope to find ways to prevent such an accident from happening again." Consequently, the board included 6 recommendations aimed at federal regulators, calling on them to improve training, certification, and oversight of special heavy load carriers. The board also recommended that the Federal Aviation Administration create a thorough certification process for personnel responsible for the proper loading, restraint, and documentation of special cargo loads, particularly heavy military vehicles on transport category airplanes. Other recommendations included in the docket call on the Federal Aviation Administration to improve its ability and quality control regarding the inspection of cargo aircraft operations, specifically those involving special cargo loads. It is expected that plenty of lives will be saved with the implementation of the recommendations issued by the National Transportation Safety Board report. The following July, the National Transportation Safety Board officially voted 4-0 to accept the staff's conclusion that the crash's probable cause was the inadequate restraints placed on heavy military equipment that allowed the cargo to shift inside the aircraft. According to Mark Dombroff, a lawyer representing National Airlines, the enterprise was severely disappointed with the outcome. National Airlines believed that an additional investigation regarding the accident should have been performed despite the evidence. As Dombroff told the Free Press, quote, "We don't agree with the probable cause that they found. The investigation did not encompass what we would have expected." Bill Hassler, pilot Brad Hassler's brother, attended the accident's hearing in Washington and stated in an interview that while it was challenging to listen to the detailed report, it was gratifying to hear that the crew was not to blame. Quote, "There was a moment of gratification to hear that the crew, my brother, the pilot, had nothing to do with that plane crashing. It was a relief." The Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber is an elusive creature. Despite being a 172-foot-wide vehicle, this model can sneak past enemy air defenses with the same radar signature of a small bird. The stealth bomber has roamed the skies since 1997, taking part in operations in Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. But despite participating in some of the most important conflicts of the 21st century, spotting a stealth bomber is quite rare, and there are only 20 models in existence. Still, in September of 2021, a B-2 model mysteriously crashed on the side of a runway and was captured on satellite by Google Maps, proving that not even the stealthiest and most expensive aircraft in the Air Force arsenal can hide from the internet. In the early morning of September 14th, 2021, a single B-2 Spirit heavy strategic bomber was involved in a crash that ended with the aircraft laying on the side of the runway at Whiteman Air Force Base, home of the Stealth Bomber Force in Missouri. While details of the occurrence remain classified, an Air Force Global Strike Command spokeswoman issued a statement regarding the events, citing that, quote, "A United States Air Force B-2 Spirit experienced an in-flight malfunction during a routine training mission and was damaged on the runway after an emergency landing." The spokeswoman confirmed there were no injuries and that a fire didn't ignite, as the aircraft was not carrying any live munitions. Immediately after the incident, the Air Force issued a temporary flight restriction order over and around Whiteman Base, encompassing a 6-mile radius. A notice was also issued to all the airmen from the Air Force Global Strike Command, restricting the airspace for 2 weeks to provide a safe environment for a prosperous accident investigation. A few months later, Google Maps photos of the incident made the rounds online, bringing attention to the case again. A photograph initially posted on Reddit shows the aircraft mostly intact, resting in a grass midfield, with possible signs of having dug into the ground with one wing. With stealth bombers' intakes and exhausts covered, and with other vehicles in sight, it is clear that Google Maps captured the moment once the recovery effort, involving many staff and vehicles, was underway. According to several aviation aficionados, the B-2 in question may have experienced a hydraulic failure mid-flight and had its main landing gear collapse during the landing maneuver, sending the aircraft off the runway with its wing digging into the ground as it stopped. While this explanation cannot be officially confirmed, the satellite image concurs with the wing-down aspect of the supposed incident. The total damage to the aircraft also remains unknown. The Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit is a heavy strategic bomber built during the Cold War that uses stealth technology to fly through enemy anti-aircraft defenses. According to former pilot William Langweisha in an article written in 2018 for The Atlantic, the Spirit, often nicknamed the Stealth Bomber, is, quote, "made to defeat the world's most advanced air defense systems. In addition to its conventional navigational capabilities, it has autonomous systems that operate independently from any ground or space-based transmitters." Complete with a bed, a toilet, and even a microwave for the 2-person crew, these features come with a price, as the B-2 is also the most expensive bomber in history. total procurement costs averaged $929 million per aircraft in 1997 currency, including spare parts, equipment, retrofitting, and software support. The hefty price tag caused the Air Force to reduce an order of 132 to only 21, which later became 20 when one crashed in 2008 in Guam. After entering service in 1997, the type became the second aircraft in the world designed to have stealth technology, after the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk. The stealth bomber was first used in combat while dropping non-nuclear ordnance in the 1999 Kosovo War, and has since served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. So far, none have been shot down in combat. Going back to their introduction, Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri has been the home base of all the service's B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. Apart from the occasional air show, sightings of the stealth bomber are rare, as there are so few in service. In addition, the precise details of this low-density, high-value strategic asset remains highly classified. However, as part of the exclusive stealth technology climb, the aircraft is most likely built and coated with unique composite materials that can be highly toxic if damaged, making the precautions taken by the Air Force after the 2021 incident unsurprising. The United States Air Force plans to operate the 20 active B-2s until the early 2030s, when the Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider advanced long-range large heavy payload aircraft will take over the stealth intercontinental strategic bomber role. The world's most expensive stealth bomber may be good at hiding from even the most modern enemy detection systems. Still, even one of the most stealthy pieces of technology in the Pentagon's arsenal can't hide from the ever-prying eyes of Google Earth. Only 3 months after the September 2021 incident, Google's satellite cameras captured a screenshot of another stealth bomber flying over a large field in Missouri. The photo was found and posted by a Reddit user, and the image has since racked up more than 111,000 upvotes, as well as countless comments from users amused by the strange discovery. The blurry, multicolored look at the Spirit bomber in the photo resulted from the way the satellite cameras separately captured photos for the red, green, and blue channels before combining them into a single full-color image. Still, spotting a B-2 bomber flying over rural Missouri is not that surprising, as the Google Maps photo was taken only 20 miles away from Whiteman Air Force Base. In March of 2022, the Air Force Global Strike Command released a report on the investigation behind the crash landing incident of 2021. According to the statement, old springs installed in the B-2 callsign Spirit of Georgia led to a left main landing gear collapse when landing on the runway at the base. The report reads, quote, "The abbreviated Accident Investigation Board president found, by a preponderance of the evidence, the cause of the mishap was that the mishap aircraft's left main landing gear lock link springs failed to provide sufficient pressure to maintain the lock links in the locked position, which resulted in a left main landing gear collapse during the mishap aircraft's landing." During the flight, the springs that caused the left landing gear to break down were later found to produce 11% less tension than they should have, and were likely obsolete. As a consequence of the sudden collapse, the stealth bomber skidded off the runway until it came to a full stop only 1 mile from the touchdown point, dragging the wing along the runway. While preliminary estimates put the cost of repairing the stealth bomber at a minimum of $10.1 million, a further assessment will determine the final number. While the report doesn't state how long the repair process will take, fixing the world's most expensive bomber is definitely doable. In the mid-2010s, another B-2 was heavily damaged by fire, but was able to fly again after 4 years. The only total loss for the B-2 Spirit heavy strategic bomber remains the one that crashed on departure from Guam in 2008. With no operational models on display and scarce public appearances, Google Maps may be the only place where this iconic bomber is constantly spotted.